everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 145 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, you better get that dirt off your shoulder because we're going to talk about limited shoulder motion. Where should you start? You got someone, or yourself maybe, who's limited in many different directions. Some might be good, some might be not so great. What should I prioritize first with my exercise selection? Well, folks, you're going to get the answer in today's debrief because that's what we're going to talk about today. Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first only question today, hey, what's up, Danny? Comes from my man, the legend, one of my favorite Kiwis of all time, Marcel. And here's what he asks. If shoulder extension and horizontal abduction are both limited, which do you chase first? You could probably also add internal rotation in there. Marcel, you are a legend. Thank you for asking this. So the question boils down to, you got someone with several shoulder restrictions. What is the order at which I attack things? So we have to look at this problem a few different ways. We have to look at it from what do each shoulder measure that I may look at, what information does that give me? How do I prioritize which ones to go after? And then what types of activities do I need to utilize to increase airflow and expansion into the areas in question? Because with shoulder measures, based on this model, the way we look at shoulder measures is they're not necessarily something that looks at a shoulder problem. Now, you can have a local shoulder issue that can impact shoulder range of motion, but we're using shoulder range of motion as a proxy to tell us where we need to put air into the thorax. And the reason why that is because most of our shoulder measures will correspond with airflow in a particular area of the body. And we're going to base this off of the anatomical location of the tissues that we will be testing excursion. So for example, if you test shoulder internal rotation and you measure passive range of motion, you're going to look at the eccentric capabilities of the external rotators, infraspinatus, teres minor, no muscle finer. So we have to ask ourselves, based on that and the orientation of the tissues, where does that correspond with the thorax? So for example, if I look at shoulder internal rotation, that's going to approximate or challenge the excursion capabilities of the oblique fibers of those muscles. So if you look at an anatomical picture of the posterior cuff, you have muscle fibers that run obliquely on the scapula, and you have muscle fibers that run transversely on the scapula. IR at 90 degrees deals with more oblique fibers. If you were to look at horizontal adduction, that would stretch more the horizontal or transverse fibers. And then what we do is when we look at where those fibers are located, we place that up against the corresponding spinal level. So we know that the scapula runs from T2 to T8-ish. Where are those fibers located in respect to where the spinal level is? So for example, if we go back to the posterior cuff, the transverse or horizontal fibers are close to around T2 to T4, whereas the oblique fibers run from T5 to T8. And that's where, if you've ever heard me segment, you need this exercise to improve T2, T4 expansion, and this one's going to go after T6, T8. That's why that is, and that's how we can utilize testing to let us know where we need to go. So if you look at the anatomy, and here are the measures that I use for shoulder range of motion. You might have different ones, but if we look at shoulder flexion, shoulder external rotation, shoulder horizontal abduction, those would be your three posterior expansion measures. and you look at shoulder extension, shoulder internal rotation, and shoulder horizontal adduction, those would be your 3 anterior-based measures. That would be how I can decide where I need to put air. So the reason why flexion, abduction, and ER correspond with backside expansion, and extension, adduction, and internal rotation coincide with front side of the thorax expansion has to do with how a concentric orientation of those tissues develop. So let's walk through this. Let's suppose that I have a loss of shoulder flexion, shoulder horizontal abduction, and shoulder external rotation. The way that that happens is I need to somehow get a concentric orientation of the internal rotators of the shoulder. Predominantly, you're looking at subscapularis because that's going to be the one that's closest to the joint. So I have to somehow IR the humeri in order to have ER-based limitations. So that would be your shoulder external rotation, horizontal AB, and shoulder flexion. Because shoulder flexion is a little bit more of an external rotation bias. Check the journal article by Paula Ludwig, which I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on, of course, folks. It'll be found on zachcouples.com/shoulder. Pretty simple. Check it out because you'll get access to the YouTube version, which will be in HD, 2 camera angles, all types of stuff. You'll get to listen to it podcast-wise, and you'll get a lovely blog post that will have some graphics to help your learning with this. So the way I need to have those measures limited, flexion, external rotation, horizontal abduction, is somehow the humerus has to internally rotate. Concentric bias. That doesn't mean that you get this crazy amount of IR. It's just there's greater resting tension of the internal rotation-based tissues. The way that that happens, if we limit motion in the thorax, is going to correspond with a reduction of posterior expansion, and here's how. Let's say I have concentric bias in the posterior thorax, meaning the thoracic spine is going to be flatter. It may not always appear that way, but just think about it from an airflow perspective. If I flatten my upper back, that's going to pull the shoulder blades backwards because most of the muscles that are going to increase the compressive elements in the upper back are on the back side of your body. A lot of them attached to the scapula. When those puppies contract, they're going to adduct and potentially externally rotate the scapula, aka pinching the shoulders together like you're trying to have a good posture when you're typing at your computer. False. I would disagree with that, but neither here nor there. So I flatten the upper back. My shoulders get pulled backward. Ooh, my chest is so proud. What you gonna do about it? But when I do this, my arms are gonna kind of go along for the ride and be in more external rotation. If I have incredibly externally rotated arms, well, I can't really do a whole lot about it. What will happen is the arms, as a consequence, to be able to be useful, movement-wise, will generally internally rotate to come back to center. We see this as well in the lower body. So if we have a pelvis that is more rightwardly rotated, oftentimes you'll see both feet will turn forward so you can walk. And that's where a lot of times you'll see restrictions like on the left side into internal rotation, and the right side will be more limited in external rotation. It's the same thing here in the thorax. I need to bring my arms back to center so I can use them. If my upper back is flat, can't get air back there, my scaps come together, not like the cool Beatles song style, and I have arms that are externally rotated, I can't use them, so I'm going to bring them in to internal rotation. Not only that, but folks, when I externally rotate a scapula and adduct it, if I keep the humerus fixed and I just do this motion here, the muscles that make the scapula externally rotate are also the muscles that internally rotate the humerus. So this is a combined action. even though it's useful to think of it from a sequencing perspective, if I have a scapula that's compressed up against the rib cage, it's smushed and it can't unstick from that position. That's because internal rotators of the humerus also act as external rotators of the scapula. So if those muscles have a little bit more concentric bias towards them, you're going to have a loss of external rotation-based measures. So now let's walk through each of the 3 external rotation-based measures that we're looking at the humerus. No joke. Well, I think shoulder external rotation makes sense because my IR muscles are going to be more concentrically biased. But if you look at the fiber direction of the subscapularis, it runs on an oblique angle, and then as it gets up closer to the top part of the scapula, kind of directly in front of the spine of the scapula, which is right along here, those fibers get more horizontal or transverse in nature. Your external rotation based fibers, that meaning that I'm going to stretch these fibers or eccentrically orient these fibers when I move my arm, run more obliquely. The oblique fibers correspond to levels T5 to T8. If you have a limitation in external rotation, you know you need to put air in the T6, T8 area. A great way to do that is with low reach activities. So anything that's 0 to 60, that will help drive air into that part of the thorax. If you have someone who is limited in horizontal abduction, that's going to test the extensibility of the transverse and horizontal fibers of the subscapularis, which is more T2 to T4 level. So if you do activities that drive expansion into T2 to T4, that should improve horizontal abduction. Moves that do that, cervical rotation-based exercises are really good for that. You can also drive things like arm bars at 90 where you're driving some external rotation. Those work really well also. Shoulder flexion is going to give you a gross approximation of posterior expansion in general. And the reason why that is because as I go from 0 to 160, 70, 80 degrees, whatever you got available, you have to be able to expand the entire backside in order to allow the scapula to move away from the spine and upwardly rotate. So if you got someone who's really limited in shoulder flexion, they might also have a corresponding loss of ER. And so you might drive expansion into the lower parts of the thorax. If they can't get that last little bit of shoulder flexion because the scapula needs to upwardly rotate, meaning the downward rotators of the scapula need to be able to eccentrically orient. And guess where they're located, folks? Upper parts of the spine. Your rhomboids are more cervical, like C7 to T5. Those muscles have to eccentrically elongate. So if you can't get those last bits of overhead motion, you might look at putting air into the uppermost parts of the thorax. And that's how you can use those measures to indicate where you need to go to put air into specific locations of the thorax. That's posterior expansion. Now let's look at expanding in the front, aka the pump handle. You have 3 measures. You have shoulder internal rotation, you have shoulder horizontal adduction coming across the body, and you have shoulder extension. Those are the 3 that I use to measure front side expansion. It's basically the same thing that we saw on the back side, but now we're looking at it in terms of cuff musculature. So let's walk through this. In order to have a restriction in those muscles, or in those motions, I should say, I need concentric bias of external rotation-based muscles. Infraspinatus, teres minor, no muscle finer, except maybe pectoralis minor. in order for that to happen, humerus has to ER somehow. Here's how that can happen. You're on a World of Warcraft bender, 36 hours, 3 Mountain Dews, and we don't go diet unless we start a riot. The chest, pump handle comes down like Charlie Brown. Shoulders are going to come forward, aka some abduction, internal rotation. So you kind of got the hunchy posture. You know what I'm talking about. You've been on that World of Warcraft bender, or maybe Mass Effect trilogy. That's kind of my preference. But when I'm in this position, my humeri are more internally rotated if they follow suit with the scapula. So in order for me to bring them back to center so I can use my arms, I need to externally rotate them, which is going to increase concentric tension or bias towards the external rotators. Or, folks, you can look at it this way. The position of the scapula in that situation with the pump handle being down, the scapula is going to come forward into abduction and internal rotation. Muscles that internally rotate the scapula also externally rotate the humerus. So if we look at the back side, if I ER the humerus, that. If I keep a fixed humerus and I pull or I tense the muscles of the posterior shoulder, that's going to pull the scapula into more internal rotation. So those muscles work together. So if you got a situation where the pump handle's down, scaps come forward, you're going to have concentric bias of external rotators, which is going to lead to a loss of ranges of motion that are associated with internal rotation. What level corresponds with each? It's the exact opposite of what we saw posteriorly. So if you look at shoulder IR, that's going to test the extensibility of the oblique fibers of your posterior cuff muscles. If you have a loss of IR, then you're going to need to expand the anterior portion of the rib cage that's associated with about T6 to T8 because that's the same level. AKA, that's the body of the sternum getting air. Ways to do that, that's where most forward reaching is really useful because forward reaching is going to drive some scapular external rotation just based off of how the scapula alters its position as I go overhead. So I get a little bit of posterior compression. If I compress the back, that's going to allow me to push more air into the front. With horizontal adduction, that's going to stress or test the extensibility of the transverse fibers of your cuff muscles on the backside. So if you need to create expansion there, you're looking at expanding on the front side where T2 to T4 is located, which is more the manubrium. And it's a little bit backwards in terms of how you can get air up in that region. Instead of going up higher, instead of taking you higher, like your favorite Creed song, you're going to go more with humeral extension-based activities. Because as I extend the humerus, what's going to happen is I'm going to anteriorly tip the scapula. And one muscle that anteriorly tilts the scapula is going to be your pectoralis minor, which attaches to ribs 3 through 5. And when that contracts, it helps pull them upwards. So that's going to at least get you a little bit of anterior expansion. But also, too, as I go into humeral extension, you're going to have the clavicle rotating a bit anteriorly. That may give a little bit of leverage to subclavius, which can also assist with the expansion that we oh so desire in the uppermost parts of the rib cage. So driving humeral extension-based activities can be useful for that. That could be a row to a tricep extension. That can be anything where you're pressing down and lifting up, any type of tricep work, stuff like that. Really good for getting expansion into the manubrium. Humeral extension is just like shoulder flexion. It gives you a gross approximation of anterior expansion with a slight bias towards the uppermost segments, because remember folks, as I drive more humeral extension, I'm going to have greater downward rotation and anterior tipping of the scapula, which is going to correspond with manubrial expansion. So if you have someone with a loss of shoulder extension, you got to put air generally in the front. The activities that I mentioned previously ought to help with that. So that's really how you go after those areas. So if you have a loss of flexion, external rotation, horizontal AB, you're pushing air in the back. If you have a loss of humeral extension, internal rotation, and horizontal adduction, you're putting air into the front. Now you might be wondering, well, Zach, I got someone who's got a mix of those limitations. Maybe you got someone who's got a loss of IR and horizontal abduction. What's going on there? Well, I'm glad you asked. What's going on there, folks, is you have someone who has got restrictions or concentric bias of both front side stuff and back side stuff at the same time. So you'll need to do things that create anterior and posterior expansion simultaneously. Ways that you can do that. My favorite cheat code is rotation. And generally, if you're like, I still don't know where to start, or maybe you're someone who's not doing a ton of table tests and you're like, well, I still want to get my people moving well, rotation is kind of the cheat code to doing that. Because when I rotate, if I reach with a single arm, and let's say my thorax rotates to the left, more so than your favorite Beyonce song, what that's going to do is I rotate to the left based on the way the spinous processes move and the rib cage rotates. You're going to get more front side expansion on the right anterior and back side expansion on the left. So now I've driven A to P expansion just by driving rotation, which is really cool. So if you can get your peeps to rotate savagely well without any compensatory activity, you're going to drive A to P expansion. You can also get A to P expansion with inversion-based exercises as well. We'll dive into that a little bit more later. So we've talked about what the measures mean. We've talked about exercises you need to use to put air into those specific areas based on restrictions. But what we haven't talked about is how to prioritize this stuff. So if you have someone who's got a bunch of these restrictions, where do you go? There's really two keys that I consider when I'm thinking about getting expansion into the thorax. Really three. The first has to involve the stack. What the stack does is it's that piston. It aligns the thoracic and pelvic diaphragm so we can move the viscera enough to give the potential for circumferential expansion or multidirectional expansion or multidimensional expansion, whatever word you want to use, into the thorax. If you can't do that and you have a situation where I'm getting greater dissension of the diaphragm, because what happens in that case is when the diaphragm has to descend a lot, you get an increase in accessory muscle activity, which is your neck muscles, your pecs, all that stuff. When that stuff contracts and helps you pull air in, it increases fill into the lower parts of the lungs. The ribs cannot expand apart because all of the superficial musculature is more tense because it's trying to bring more air in, and you're going to have a loss of shoulder range of motion. We don't want that. And the way we can circumvent that is by making sure that our supreme clientele has the capability of creating a stack. And folks, if they can't stack, they probably shouldn't talk to Zach. So you want to get that first. But let's suppose that you have that. There's two principles that I follow when I'm thinking about creating expansion into the thorax. The first is making sure you fill the rib cage bottom up. I want you to take a look at this cup of water. Brought to you by Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare, where I work at in wonderful Las Vegas. Check us out if you're there. If I were to fill this glass of water, how does it fill? You ready? Watch. Wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, folks. What did you just witness? it filled from the bottom up. And that's the only way it can fill. I can't fill the middle part of the glass of water if it's standing upright, of course, like this. I can't fill like a little bit in the bottom and then a little bit in the top and then put a little bit extra in the middle. No, it fills from the bottom up. If you are standing or you're living life against gravity, your lungs fill in a similar manner. They fill with air from the bottom up. And that's how we want to approach expansion in the thorax. So if I need to create more range of motion in the rib cage, I'm going to do the exact same concept there. I'm going to fill the rib cage from the bottom up. Most people, if they have a lot of accessory muscle activity and they're concentrically biased in the thorax, you're going to create the stack first because that's like filling the bottom part of the water glass. And then you're going to go to the next level, T6, T8. Oh, folks, that's your shoulder external rotation and internal rotation. Then you're going to go up a little higher, which would be your horizontal adduction, abduction, to fill that part of the glass. And then you're going to get the finishing touches by going after shoulder flexion and extension, so you fill the uppermost parts of the glass. So we want to approach it the same way. The example that Marcel talked to us about, someone who's got a loss of horizontal abduction and shoulder IR. Well, IR is lower than horizontal abduction. So I'm going to try to fill the lower part first with a forward reach or whatever to restore that measure, because I need to fill that part of the cup before I go filling the top part of the cup, which is horizontal abduction. So you can apply that same framework when you're working with your supreme clientele. You put all your measures together and you see, okay, they're limited here, here, and here. Where on that glass of water do I got to fill first? Stack first, make sure the ISA is dynamic, and then you're going your ER, IR, then you're going AB, AD, and then you're going flexion, extension. In that order. Now, that's one piece. The other piece that we have to take into consideration is the infrasternal angle presentation. Because based off of the infrasternal angle, you're going to have a little bit more wiggle room in terms of where you can put air versus not. Because with each ISA presentation, there's going to be a certain bias of range of motion restrictions that they should have. So if we look at someone with a wide ISA, the sacrum is going to be a little bit more nutated, meaning this person's spine or their center of mass is going to fall forward. So if they can't manage that, their first compensatory strategy is to concentrically bias the backside of the body, meaning that a wide ISA should be limited in posterior measures, which, what are they, folks? They're shoulder external rotation, horizontal abduction, and flexion. So if those are limited, that's a normal part of the wide infrasternal angle. But I'm sure you've worked with a couple wide ISAs in your day who've had a loss of shoulder extension, shoulder internal rotation, and shoulder horizontal adduction. What's going on there? Well, I'm glad you asked. So think of it this way. If I fell forward first and I concentrically biased the backside of my body, perhaps they sense, oh crap, I'm going to fall backwards. I can't have that. So then what will happen is they may concentrically bias the front side of the body to bring themselves back to center. And now you have a situation where there's some A to P compression or restrictions, front side and back side. Bigger muscles are creating that front side expansion because they have more leverage to pull, or they have to work harder to pull my body into an upright position. Because think about it this way. If I have some of my back muscles pulling me back, well, muscles on the front side of the thorax, like your transversus thoracic and whatnot, aren't going to have enough leverage to win against the erector spinae. So you might have to use pecs and other muscles on the front side, maybe even rectus deamniorchilidus abdominis, to pull you forward. What you have to do in that situation is you have to create a gradient so I can have some movement happen. There's going to be a little bit more flexibility of front side because that is a later compensation that happens if we look at it from the sequencing perspective. Now, folks, that doesn't mean that, oh, I started here and I now became this. This likely all happens at once, just based on genetics, anthropometrics, and a multitude of other factors. But I also think that it's useful to think of it from a sequencing perspective when knowing where we got to address first. So with that in mind, you need to create front side expansion first, because that's the outer layer of compensation, before I go after backside expansion with these individuals. And at least when I work with a lot of people who are wide infrasternal angles, by going after that, even if I'm doing just basic stacking where I see the ISA become a little bit more dynamic, a lot of times I see the internal rotation-based measures clean up first in comparison to the ER-based measures, especially if someone's really stiff and they're wide. And that's just based off of my clinical experience. Now, with this population, the wide ISAs, you might think, well, Zach, you said rotation's kind of like the cheat code, so can I just rotate them and life will be good? Well, in theory, yes, but here's the issue. A wide ISA is going to have a significantly harder time creating rotation without compensation. And the reason why that has to do with their rib cage structure. With the wide ISA, because the rib cage is further out, it's bigger side to side, the ribs are in a more bent posture, your big rotators of the thorax and the ventral cavity, your external obliques, are not going to have much leverage to drive rotation. So they will have a significantly harder time performing rotational-based activity, especially someone who's super wide. So if you do use rotation, you got to make sure that you have closed the lower rib cage quite a bit first before using that as a way to increase available range of motion. So I would look into doing that first, getting the ISA dynamic, maybe driving some front side expansion. And then if you're feeling frisky, you can drive some rotation. For the narrow ISA, flip-flop everything. For a narrow, if the sacrum is more counternutated, their spine's going to fall backwards. You ought not do that. So what they're going to do is they're going to concentrically bias the front side of the body first, bringing them forward, meaning that they should have a loss of shoulder extension, shoulder internal rotation, and shoulder horizontal AD, as in dog, duction. So you would, in theory, drive front side expansion first. And a lot of times, if you restore the dynamics of the ISA, you'll see those measures clear up. However, if they have a loss of shoulder flexion, external rotation, horizontal abduction, that would be a secondary compensation because I fell backwards initially. Oh, snap, I'm going to fall forward now. Oh, crap, I'm falling too far forward. Boom. I need to concentrically bias the backside in order to maintain upright positioning. Again, this likely all happens at once based on anthropometrics, but it's useful to think of it from a sequencing perspective. In that situation, once you get the ISA dynamic, you may have to go after backside expansion first before front side because you have to create a gradient. The later compensation, I got bigger muscles at play. I need to get those puppies to chill so then I can drive front side. Now, the nice thing about narrows is because they have a more closed rib cage angle, the rotators of the trunk, your obliques, are going to have a bit more leverage. So it's easier to drive rotation with these people. But you have to watch to make sure that as they reach with a single arm, they're not crunching. So you just have to be mindful of that. But it's generally easier to drive rotation and subsequent A to P expansion with that particular population. Now, we talked about how to sequence these things, and I mentioned AP expansion. In this population in particular, I've seen it to be more effective to apply inversion to also get AP expansion than other people. And I think the reason why this is because with a narrow ISA, based upon the amount of descension that the diaphragm undergoes compared to the wide, and this has to do with the structural composition and the diameter of their ventral cavity, the diaphragm is going to descend a lot further in a narrow in comparison to a wide. That's one reason why the rib cage is generally narrower, because as the diaphragm descends further, eventually what will happen is its line of pull changes on the lower rib cage. It causes the rib cage to invert a bit more, because normally when you breathe in, the rib cage should expand. So if it flattens, it will actually pull the ribs inward, which give the external obliques, among other muscles, a little bit more leverage. So with that in mind, if I have so much lower expansion, and I, as a consequence, have a lot of subsequent superior compression, sometimes inverting, which will fill the lungs top down because I'm now tipped upside down, can be really useful. And you might have to go with that first with this particular population, because not doing that really puts you at a disadvantage from being able to attain a stack. Because really what the stack entails is making sure that the thoracic diaphragm can fully ascend, so you get enough air out so then you can create the potential for expansion. Sometimes if I have too much downward diaphragm descension, it can be hard for me to generate enough tension in the lower part of the rib cage and the ab wall to allow the diaphragm to fully ascend and subsequently allow for me to fill the lungs. So just a little tidbit for your narrow ISAs. And those are really the major keys of driving air into the thorax. So let me provide a brief summary of everything that we talked about, because this was a long one, but a good one. Flexion, horizontal AB, external rotation associated with posterior expansion. Dive in earlier to know why. Shoulder extension, horizontal adduction and internal rotation is more front side expansion. You want to fill the rib cage from the bottom up. Stack is lowest. ER and IR is the next level. ABAD is the next highest level. Flexion extension is the highest levels because it gives you a broad spectrum overview of how well they can expand front side and back side. Fill from the bottom up. Respect, put some respect on the structure, and you have to appreciate the ISA in terms of whether you need to go front side or back side first. If I'm a wide ISA, the primary compensation is backside. Concentric bias. The secondary compensation is front side concentric bias. So if you have someone who's got a loss of front side measures and they're wide, go after that first, after the stack, then go after backside expansion. For a narrow, it's flip-flopped. For a narrow ISA, they should be limited front side as their primary compensation. Backside is their secondary compensation. Go after backside if that's limited, then go after front side. The cheat code for both, if you need A to P expansion, is rotation. If you can get someone to rotate without compensatory activity, that will get you a broad amount of front side and backside expansion, because in order for me to rotate effectively, I need to be able to expand in both of those directions. And the nice thing is it creates an inherent gradient so you can have movement occur and life should be good. And if you do those things, you can bet your bottom dollar that no one's going to mess with you, and you ought to be in business. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. Now, folks, if you are like, well, Zach, I haven't really been measuring shoulder range of motion. I don't know how to best do that. And moreover, I don't know how to best apply interventions to increase range of motion in my shoulders. What shall I do about it? Well, what you should do about it is attend Human Matrix, my seminar, which we are having this year. And we're taking a ton of protective measures to make sure it is the safest seminar in the industry. And that includes, but not limited to, taking temperature checks and making sure that as of today, unless things change, we're going to have people have required testing before you come into the seminar. We're going to be bringing the KN95 masks. We're going to socially distance as best as we can. And we're going to sanitize the F out of everything, temperature checks, everything I can do to ensure your safety at these seminars. It's going to be happening. And folks, there is one next week if you are in Atlanta where the players play. And we write on them things like every day, the first one of the year, February 20th, 21st, next Saturday and Sunday. Sign up. It is going to happen. It's getting serious. What you going to do about it? But if you can't make that one, there's a few others throughout the year. April 10th and 11th, Warren, Ohio. May 29th and 30th in Boston, Massachusetts. August 14th, 15th, Ann Arbor, Michigan. September 25th, 26th, Wyckoff, New Jersey. November 6th and 7th in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I got a few others in the pipeline that I'm just waiting to confirm. I hope to see you at some. And I hope that, hope that you can make it because I miss seeing you wonderful folks. So do that. But once you've done that, and where can I register for that, you might be wondering. Well, the answer, folks, is zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter because, folks, you'll get a bunch of free stuff. Everyone likes free things, but how about free things that will make you better at your craft? Like access to my seminar that's free, Human Matrix Foundations. If you want to get the nitty-gritty of the anatomy, the biomechanics, and everything that you need, the basic concepts to get the most out of this kind of stuff, that's the place to do it. And, of course, it's one thing to have the didactic stuff, but what about the practical aspects? Okay, so Zach, you talked about front-side, back-side restrictions. What does that look like on the training floor? Well, you can find that out with the Common Compensations Workbook, which goes to my newsletter subscribers. And basically, it's a nice little checklist of if you see this happening when someone's squatting or that happening while they're rowing, it can give you some implications about where they might be restricted and what you need to do about it. You'll get about 5 hours of talks, a free acute to chronic workload calculator as well. And also, folks, you're going to get access to weekend goodies from your boy every Friday. So check that out. I also offer a lot of services, a movement consultation. If you're someone who is limited in all those measures and you're like, you've tried some stuff on my YouTube channel, Zach Couples, check it out. And you're like, I just can't get my range of motion to improve. Maybe I need a little bit of help. Well, you're looking at someone who can help you. Because what we can do, folks, remotely through the internets is I can perform an assessment on you, see where you're limited, and give you my expert level of coaching so you can get the range of motion improvements you need to just kick some booty and take some names. Check it out for show. If you want to kick it up a notch from a Lagasse style, you're like, okay, Z, my shoulders are moving and grooving like a boss, but I need to get gains. I need to get them biceps like you got. Well, the way you can do that is by doing online training with me. I only have 3 spots available, I believe. 2 or 3, I got checked. But what that will entail is that you'll get the same movement consultation, but not only will I coach you on the spot to make sure you get the most out of your moves so you can groove, but we'll apply what your range of motion restrictions are to your fitness goals so you can also build fitness simultaneously. Check it out for sure. Maybe, though, you just want to figure out, well, Zach, how do I do that with my Supreme clientele? You can do that by mentoring with your boy, because what I can do is I can help you solve any didactic issues that you have with the material. If you're still having a hard time grasping this conceptually, I get it. Let me teach you one-on-one and we can help you out. But moreover, folks, there's not a deficit of information out there. You can learn this stuff from me. You can learn it from anybody. But what's tough is the application process. And that's where I think the mentorship program is really helpful, because what I have a lot of my people do is I want to see how you apply this. What exercises would you choose based on these restrictions? How would you apply this in a group setting? What does it look like when you coach someone through the stack? Is it whack? Well, you may be able to talk to Zach and then let me help you get it better so your clients can reach their movement goals faster than ever before. Once you scoured zachcouples.com, you read all the blogs, you signed up for the newsletter, you did every service with me, and you're like, I want more, I can't get enough. I get it. Check me out on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher by searching The Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There's 144 other debriefs out there, and, didn't all have 2 camera angles. They didn't all have that fancy light. Check those out by searching for me on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. While you're there, leave a review so the fam can keep growing. I'm also on social medias. Check me out at Facebook and Twitter, Z Couples. Of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby, at Zach, Z-A-C, couple C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And you can also find me on YouTube if you want to see what exercises I use with my Supreme clientele. When you should use what, that's the place to do it. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. And I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.